Last week, Macron hit the headlines once again when he told Politico reporters on his plane back from Beijing that Europe should work to reduce its dependency on the US, and strongly implied that European militaries wouldn't get involved in a conflict over Taiwan. In Politico's readout of the interview, which was published on Sunday and apparently edited by Macron's entourage, Macron's quoted as saying that the great risk for Europe is that it gets caught up in crises that aren't ours, i.e. Taiwan, which would apparently prevent Europe from building its strategic autonomy and reduce Europeans to, quote, just America's followers. Originally, the reaction to this interview was almost entirely negative, especially in the US and the more Atlanticist parts of the EU. But this is in some sense unsurprising, and what's perhaps more interesting is how many European leaders have tacitly endorsed Macron's push for strategic autonomy by staying conspicuously quiet. So in this video, we're going to have a look at what Macron actually said in that infamous interview, how it's been received, and what all this tells us about EU-US relations going forward. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So this story probably starts last week, when Macron and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen visited Beijing to meet with President Xi and other senior members of the CCP. Before the trip, von der Leyen made it clear that it was going to be a relatively friendly affair, and that as part of the EU's new de-risking, not decoupling strategy towards China, she wanted to maintain cordial diplomatic relations with China. During their 3 days there, Macron, Xi and von der Leyen talked mostly about foreign policy, including Ukraine, Taiwan and the great power competition between China and the US. The trip ended up being a remarkably friendly affair, and at the end of the trip, the two sides released a 51-clause statement where, amongst other things, France reaffirmed its commitment to the One China principle and expressed support for several points of China's Ukraine peace plan, while China reaffirmed its commitment to the development of EU-China relations. Xi also said that China supports Macron's notion of European strategic autonomy and considers Europe an independent pole in a multipolar world. Now, this was already causing some consternation in both the US and the more Atlanticist parts of the EU, not least because Macron's last attempt at autocrat diplomacy didn't turn out so well. However, it was the exclusive interview Macron gave to Politico on his flight back that really upset people. In the subsequent article, Politico quoted Macron as saying that the great risk for Europe is that it gets caught up in crises that are not ours, warning that unless it pursued strategic autonomy and pushed back against what Macron termed the extraterritoriality of the US dollar, Europe could end up as an American vassal. This went down like a lead balloon in Eastern Europe and the US, especially amongst Republicans. A group of MEPs released a statement insisting Macron didn't speak for Europe. Ted Cruz accused Macron of openly screwing the US, and former President Trump accused Macron of kissing Xi's ass.
You got this crazy world is blowing up and the United States has absolutely no say, and Macron, who's a friend of mine, is over with China, kissing his ass, in China.
The Elysée tried to clarify Macron's comments, insisting in a statement on Tuesday that France is not equidistant between China and the United States, which it considers an ally with shared values, and that France intends to continue its cooperation with Taiwan as a recognized democratic system. But the damage had been done. The same day, the Prime Minister of Poland pushed back against Macron, insisting that the alliance with the United States is the absolute foundation of our security. Since then, the Western press has been full of headlines talking about how controversial Macron's interview was. But, well, to our minds, this reaction shouldn't come as much of a surprise. After all, Macron has been pushing for European strategic autonomy for years, and the US and Eastern Europe have always resisted it. Sure, the language Macron used was perhaps unnecessarily colourful, and the timing was undeniably poor. Macron gave the interview on Friday, just a few hours before the PLA announced a series of aggressive military drills around Taiwan. And it was published on Sunday, when PLA ships were so close to Taiwan that they were squaring off against the Taiwanese Navy. But this is stuff Macron has been saying for years. He first started talking about strategic autonomy 6 years ago, and he hasn't let up on it since. It's also worth mentioning that Macron was actually pretty nice to the US in the full version of the interview, which was published by Les Echos on Monday. In that version of the interview, Macron complimented Biden's commitment to democracy and his love of Europe, and said that Biden's political priorities, us as number one and China as number two, were understandable. What's perhaps more interesting than the reaction from the US is the muted response from most of Europe. In the past, Macron's talk of strategic autonomy was reliably rubbished as grandiose, neo-Gaullist nonsense. This time, only the Polish Prime Minister has distanced himself from Macron's comments, and even then, he didn't explicitly refer to Macron. Basically, every other European leader has stayed quiet, and it's worth noting that the EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, is currently in Beijing. The chief whip of Germany's ruling SPD party said that Macron is right on Wednesday, and the leader of the European Council, Charles Michel, said on Tuesday that Europe shouldn't blindly, systematically follow the position of the United States on all issues, and that lots of European leaders secretly agreed with Macron. This is something Macron actually mentioned in his interview, when he claimed that he had won the ideological battle for European strategic autonomy. And, well, he's sort of got a point. More and more European leaders use the language of strategic autonomy, and while the war in Ukraine might have reinvigorated NATO, it's also forced the EU to take its own security more seriously, as has the continued political dysfunction in the US. Ultimately, whether or not Macron is actually right about European strategic autonomy, i.e. whether it's really plausible to think that Europe could become, in Macron's words, a third superpower without the help of the US, what's clear is that it's becoming an increasingly popular position amongst Europeans, who don't really want to get caught up in the brewing great power competition between China and the US. Anyway, that's all for this video, but there's a whole world of TLDR content out there. You might not know, but we actually have 5 different TLDR channels explaining news from the UK, Europe and the rest of the world, breaking down the latest developments in the business world and also running through the day's most important news that you might have missed. TLDR has been doing this for around 6 years now, so to celebrate our anniversary, we'd love it if you subscribed. Not only to this channel, but also any of the others that interest you. They're all linked in the description. Our whole purpose is to make the world around you more understandable, to unpack the confusing parts of the news in a way that's interesting, factual, and entirely non-partisan. So, if that's something you're into, then you have 5 channels to enjoy. Thanks for your support over the last 6 years. It really means a lot.